Africa south of the Sahara Desert, the human geography aspect that we'll be covering today is the history. Let's get started. Okay, so just talk about this before we get started. Africa, once again, giving out this disclaimer. I know we have people all over the world listening to the videos and tuning into the station. With very brief overview of the history of sub-Saharan Africa. It aligns with the curriculum for this particular class I'm teaching. Very vast, much. It cannot possibly be covered in 15 minutes that this video will take. Okay, so what I'll do is hit the highlights of the history going along that aligns with my particular curriculum for the high school world geography class that I am teaching. This is in no way this is just the briefest, just aligning with my curriculum. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, and you'll see why. Now you'll see why why I gave that kind of long disclaimer. The earliest inhabitants. We talk about Africa and Africa, specifically sub-Saharan Africa. This is very well. This is the part of the world that is understood by scientists, that scientists have recognized to be the birthplace of humanity. All human beings are descendant. We are descendant from the first people, which all scientific evidence points in Africa, Southeast Africa. The first human beings. All of our fossil records, everything shows that the first people developed and came from Africa. All right. So there are no written records that exist on the earliest inhabitants for Africa's earliest people. However, some information can be gathered about the early inhabitants, analyzing scenes painted on rocks and cave drawings. So when we look at this is how we know about people or the earliest inhabitants from Africa through the cave drawings, scene drawings on rocks, fossil records. Now, the fossil records show that Homo sapiens, which is what we as human beings are classified as, Homo sapiens, the first humans, they lived in southern and eastern Africa, anywhere from between 150 to 100,000 years ago. So scientifically proven, we have scientific evidence that shows the first fossils that human beings existed in Africa 150 to 100,000 years ago. And what this map shows is Africa, and it shows the migration pattern. It discusses some of the things we talked about as far as how people came to different places over the land bridge. But it is a visual representation of the migration pattern that early man took. And around 70,000 years ago, we saw that the species, fossil records indicate that Homo sapiens, they expanded out of Africa. And what happened is they began to colonize the entire planet. So we're looking at basically, let's take a quick look at this illustration. And we'll take a look at this illustration. And all right, here we go. On Africa, the red part represents, of course, human beings, earliest fossils, 150,000 to 130 years ago. In this part of Africa, I want to say the earliest fossils that we have are in the Horn area of Africa, which is right here in Ethiopia. I want to say it's in Ethiopia, the earliest fossils, and then the rest are in southern Africa. But that is where, as last reading, the first fossils, the earliest fossils of man have been found here. What it shows us, though, is that the early man migrated out of Africa after about approximately 60,000 years, migrated out of Africa, went into northern Africa, migrated out of sub-Saharan Africa, went to northern Africa. And look, it was not, there could have been, there was a climate change, but back then, if you guys remember from my past lectures, the Sahara Desert was not always a desert. So during the early part, 15,000 years ago, the earth tilted and the temperature changed some, so it became a desert. But before, it was not a desert region, okay? So the climate was still different than southern Africa, but it's not, it was not what we see today at all. It was a very, fertile area. So what we see is that the earliest man left. They migrated. The next piece that we see fossils are early man migrating through the African or Arabian Peninsula, what we today call the Middle East. Fossils here, China about approximately 67,000 years ago. 70,000 years ago, we find evidence of life in China. About 40,000 years ago, evidence of life in Europe. About 40 to 60,000 years ago, evidence of life in Australia. We discussed this earlier when we discussed at the beginning of the school year when we discussed America. The earliest settlers from America is believed to have came across the land bridge from Asia to North America. And at this point in time, during the Ice Age, this was actually land. Asia and North America, the continents that we today call Asia and America, they touched. Earliest man came down on the land bridge approximately 20,000 years ago through America and into South America approximately 13,000 years ago. And just back to our notes, what that tells us we have fossil evidence. The fossil evidence shows us that about 70,000 years ago, once again, just kind of updating that, about 70,000 years ago, we started seeing the species of human beings. We started expanding out of Africa to colonize or settle the entire planet. And about 10,000 years ago, the fossil evidence shows, or scientific evidence shows, that we as people, Homo sapiens, had spread to all the corners of the world. And the way that, of course, that we get this evidence through fossils, we also trace each other. We also use genetic testing to trace common ancestry, to kind of trace back in our genes that everyone came from a common grandmother, and it was in Africa. So, and I think we'll read an article about that in class coming up. But it's traced the migration of the early people, or it's traced by linguistic, cultural, and genetic evidence, and that is what we're talking about. We'll do a reading on that in class pretty soon. Okay, so the next thing we'll touch on, and we'll go real big jump, right? We go real big jump from prehistoric times to about the 1200s, or right around 1200 AD, and we'll talk about European exploration and expansion. So about 1200 AD, we start seeing Europeans really widespread due to technology, ships, all those things. We see a renewed interest in Europeans trading with sub-Saharan Africa. Because if you remember, up until before this time, up until, let's say, prehistoric times, definitely up to about 100. We talk about prehistoric times before the birth of Jesus Christ. Europe and North Africa had a lot of contact, tremendous contact between Europe and North Africa. But we're discussing now around the 1200s is when we start seeing contact with Europe and sub-Saharan Africa, Africa below the Saharan Desert. We start seeing extensive contact and trading. There had been contact, but we start seeing extensive contact and trading around 1200. So around this time, Africa became part of what we call the triangle trade system, which is where we have manufactured goods were traded for slaves and raw materials. They were traded between the Europeans, Africans, and colonists in America. And what this illustration is of the triangle trade system, and this is of the 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And what would happen is if you just follow along with the map or follow along with this picture, slaves were traded from Africa to the Americas. The majority of the slaves ended up in South America. The majority of African slaves ended up in South America or the American Caribbean. From the Americas, they took raw materials. So gold, ivory, all those things. Gold, those things went from the America. Wood, all those things went from the Americas to Europe. Those were transferred from Europe. They were transformed from raw materials to finished products, guns, clothing, those things. And those finished materials, those manufactured goods, were sent from Europe, were then traded from European countries to African countries for slaves. And it just started the whole triangle process again. So once again, triangle process, triangle trade, it went like this. From Africa, people from Africa, and the Africans and the Americans traded for slaves. And the Africans traded slaves to the Americans. The Americans sent raw materials to And so we went from slaves went from Africa to the Americas. From the Americas, slaves, they mined or farmed raw materials. Those raw materials were sent to Europe, and where they were sent in the factories of Europe, those raw materials were turned into finished products or goods, and those finished products or goods were sent to Africa and traded for slaves. So this is what we call the triangle trade system. And we'll spend the majority of this video is just kind of discussing the timeline of the African, of the interaction between Africa on a major scale, sub-Saharan Africa and European. So around 1200s, like I mentioned earlier, we start to see really large-scale trading between the Europeans and Africans. Between the 1400s and 1600s, you started seeing trading posts being established along the different the African coast, the sub-Saharan African coast around this time. Now, one thing I want you guys to remember, or just I wanted to kind of bring your attention to help you understand this, it was during this time Europeans did not go into Africa. They could not go into Africa for a few reasons. One, they did not have the immunity built up to the diseases like malaria at that time. They could not navigate the terrain completely. It was just like going to another planet for them. Okay. So difficult terrain and diseases like malaria prevented Europeans from traveling beyond the coast of Africa. So that was another reason why you think about the triangle trade. That is why Europeans needed finished products to trade with Africans, with Arabs and Africans, or Africans who participated in the slave trade. They needed that because the Europeans themselves could not earlier go into Africa. It took them hundreds of years before they were able to actually have the technology developed so that they felt comfortable going into Africa. And moving on the timeline, we see between the 1600s and the 1700s, the Europeans began intensively trading raw materials and enslaved workers with the Africans. Around this time, we saw, especially, this is around the time I want you guys to think about, around the time of the colonization of the United States, or the Americas, North and South America, increased demand in African slaves. And this, of course, these two pictures, one is of what artist rendering of what it was like on the deck of a slave ship during the time when they took kids. These were kids, a lot of kids being born on the ships in the Middle Passage, what we call. And this map illustrates just another illustration of the triangle trade. Tells you about approximately throughout the slave trade, through the triangle trade, approximately 12 million people went from the coast of Africa. The couple hundred years of the slave trade, that is approximately 1,200 people went from Africa to the Americas. So 1,200 people were kidnapped and moved from Africa to the United States, or not to the United States, from Africa to North and South America. So to give you guys an idea about that, that is approximately everyone in the state of Louisiana and probably half the state of Mississippi. So that is the number of people that we're talking about that were kidnapped, West Africans, or Africans primarily from the West Coast, that were kidnapped and moved from Africa to the United States over this time frame that we're discussing. So approximately everyone in the state of Louisiana and half of the state of Mississippi. Tremendous amount of people. And next, taking a look at the next thing we'll go to on our timeline are the 1800s, where we start to see that Europeans began to colonize Africa. So I want you guys to think about, for the first 600 years of Africa, of interaction between Europeans and sub-Saharan Africa, no colonization. Europeans worked with the Africans. Around the 1800s, the Europeans began to colonize Africa. And what that means, they began to take over the country. From the native Africans. Think about what happened here. Very similar to what occurred here in the United States with the Native Americans, not just in the United States. Very similar to what occurred in the Americas, what was done with the Native Americans, the native people who lived in North America and South America. This started occurring to Native Africans around the 1800s. Okay, so around the 1800s, Europeans began to colonize Africa. The reason they were able to do this, and when they were not able to do this before, is because the reason why it took 600 years for this to occur is because by this time Europeans had actually developed enough technology. Their technology had developed enough to where they felt comfortable being in Africa, to be able to conquer the terrain and the people. So there's new technology, like the steam engine, and they developed cures to diseases like malaria, and they allowed Europeans to actually travel inland to bring their equipment, their technology inland. You have to remember Africa is the temperatures, very harsh, very harsh. So it was hard for Europeans to make it, and there were more people in Africa than were in the Americas at this time too. So it took longer for the same thing to occur to the people of the Americas that occurred to the people in Africa. And the word that we use for this, there is a word that we use so when countries colonize or take over another country, or when stronger countries take over another country, we call that imperialism. And imperialism is when a stronger country dominates a weaker country politically, economically, and culturally. And the main reason that European countries, of course, colonized Africa was for access to the natural resources that were in Africa. Very similar to what occurred in the Americas, okay? Gold, diamonds, for access to gold, diamonds, people, etc. And what this graphic illustrates, we'll go into it a little bit more, but what this graphic illustrates is the part, Africa, of course. This is a map of Africa, and it shows the parts of Africa that were taken over by foreign countries. And I'll go over it a little bit more in a second. So, yes. So, here we go again. Much bigger version of it. So what we see is pretty much the French had most of North Africa. The British had a lot of Western Africa, some of Western Africa, a lot of Eastern Africa, Southern Africa. The Portuguese were in some of Southern Africa. The green represents the Germans. The purple represents the Spanish and Mauritania. And, of course, the white parts were independent. This is Liberia. They came under the protection of the United States. Because it was formed, ended up being a former slave colony. It was a colony made up of former slaves, and so they had the protection of slaves from the United States, and they had the protection of the United States. This area represents Ethiopia, which was able to stay independent during this time. But by 1914, of course, this picture represents Africa in 1914, but by 1914, European countries had controlled or claimed all of Africa except for Liberia and Ethiopia. And Liberia had a special relationship with the United States because Liberia was protected from being colonized because it was made up of former slaves of the United States. In 1945, after 1945, the calls for freedom became very strong after World War II. So what that means is after World War II, after the world overthrew the tyranny after the world went through this big war to fight Hitler and Mussolini, the countries in Africa that had been colonized by European countries by this time, maybe hundreds of years, for a couple of hundreds of years, they started demanding independence of their own. And so what we started seeing is from between the 1950s and the 1980s, African states slowly gained their independence from the European powers. Now, what the European countries, they attempted to do is when they left Africa, they would try, sometimes it was violently, sometimes sometimes the people were able to gain their independence violently. Sometimes it was through the cooperation of the colonial power. But a lot of times, what happened is that when the European countries left, they attempted to make their own, we kept the borders of that they formed between themselves. The problem is that Africa is not one place. It's not like the United States where we all speak predominantly the same language and we're all predominantly the same religion. Completely different. Many different ethnic groups in the United States. I'll say this in class, and we'll talk about this in class sometimes, but in the United States, we're predominantly one ethnic group. We're predominantly the ethnic group of the United States of America, which means that we mostly speak English. We celebrate the same traditions: Christmas, New Year's, Easter, Thanksgiving, same sports, baseball, football, all those things, basketball, predominantly Christian, right? English. It's not like that in Africa. Africa is completely different. The people speak many different languages, many different native languages, many different religions, tribal religions. There's some of the major monotheistic religions here. So what you end up happening, or what ended up occurring, is, if you can see by this map represents the different ethnic groups that are in Africa. Each of the colors is a different ethnic group. And if you look really, really, really closely, you'll see that the map also shows the outlines of countries. However, the different ethnic groups cross the borders of countries. So what you end up happening is different ethnic groups in different countries, or more than one ethnic group in a country. Sometimes you might have as many as 3 different ethnic groups in a country. And when that happens, and this all occurred because of the borders that Europeans created, that the Europeans created for the Africans when they left Africa. Now you have rivalries, or now that you have civil wars between the different ethnic groups, because each ethnic group wants to look out for the people in their ethnic group. Okay, so each of the ethnic groups looks out, and we're talking about the Afro-Asiatic ethnic groups in the north, which are predominantly, a lot of them are Muslims. Very, very good, very strong ties with Islam. The Nilo-Saharan ethnic group, the Niger-Congo ethnic group, the first one, the Niger-Congo ethnic group B, the Kyrgyzstan ethnic group, the Autosatarian ethnic group, many different ethnic groups, a lot of wars, a lot of the fights, a lot of strife that you see occurring now, a lot of the political instability in Africa today is caused by what we're looking at, what you see on this map, which is that there are sometimes two and three different ethnic groups living in a country together, and the majority ethnic groups oftentimes oppress the minority ethnic groups, or they seek to oppress the ethnic groups, and it's all kinds of turmoil. And once again, this is one of the primary causes of the internal conflict in Africa today. Going back to the timeline, we'll focus a little bit on South Africa, with a part that, now, of course, we're studying sub-Saharan Africa, but I want to study the country of South Africa, which is highlighted in the green and made up of this, and of course is encircled here. Post-World War II, South Africa was taken over by the Dutch colonists, Dutch settlers, the descendants of the Dutch settlers to South Africa. They came around the 17th century, and they formed the African National Party, okay? So they came to party in South Africa, and what the African National Party did, they legalized and strengthened the policy of racial separation that was already there, called apartheid. So these are just some of the symbols, or these are pictures. These are pictures of some of the maps. Pictures of some of the signs that were up in apartheid. And of course, you see danger in this particular one that I'm taking a look at now. It says danger. No natives, Indians, and coloreds. If you enter these premises at night, you'll be listed as missing. Armed guards shoot on sight. Savage dogs devour a corpse. You have been warned. The other sign reads, for use by white persons. The public premises and the amenities, therefore, have been reserved for the exclusive use of white persons. And so this is what these are. This is not in the United States during Jim Crow. This is actually in Africa during the time what we call apartheid in South Africa. In South Africa. And of course, to make matters worse, the African National Party, the Dutch settlers were the minority. They were by far the minority of the people in the country, and they were oppressing on a large scale the people who made up the majority of the country. Talking about Nelson Mandela, he's a leader of the African National Congress in South Africa, and what they were a group that demanded reforms and an end to apartheid. And this is actually a picture of Nelson Mandela when he was a young man in 1962. In 1962, Nelson Mandela was jailed on charges of treason by the African National Party. In 1990, South African president, de Klerk, released Nelson Mandela in jail. In 1989 to early 90s, we saw the end of apartheid in South Africa. And in 1994, they held the first election that was open in South Africa to all races, and Nelson Mandela was the first president. So remember, highlight the homework learning targets in your notes, highlight the answers to the homework learning targets in your notes, answer all bolded questions. The end. Have a good day. See you guys in class.